Hello Blenditos, my name is Johannes, and in the following tutorial I want to introduce you to UVs and texturing. Later in the series we'll also dive into Marvelous Designer and Substance Painter to create the assets at display here. You can get those on my website, just check the links in the video description. We'll use the extraordinary text tools throughout the entire series, which is a set of tools to facilitate the UV unwrapping and texture baking process. Okay, so here in Blender, let's change the layout to UV editing up here. We need to install the add-on, so go to File, then User Preferences, and look for the zip file which you downloaded from the website. Click on Install Add-on from File and navigate through your myriad of folders. Okay, you can use the file browser search field up there. The latest version is 1.3. Hit the check mark and we are ready to go. When you open up the add-on config, you'll see that he recommends to use a nightly build, which allows you to bake the bevel shader. It's a super awesome feature and extremely easy to use, but I'll stick to the basic 2.79 version here. Further down you can find the donate button. If you think it's worth it after this tutorial, I'm sure the original developer would appreciate your support. Once it's installed, we can find it in the UV editing window. In the beginning there was darkness. Or at least some muddy boring grey from the base material. And then UVs and then textures and some principles suit here too. And then our digital forefathers developed things like ambient occlusion, cavity, and normal maps, and quite a few other things. And today we have to understand all these concepts before we create our imaginary worlds. So here I stand, delivering a big nugget of knowledge to you, which was gathered from the depths of the internet, paying the ultimate price. A lot of time. I've worked a few weeks on this, so if you want to support me, just stick around and watch the end card, if you dare. Anyways, are you ready? Here we go. Imagine your latest 3D model to be made up like a gown or a dress. In my case that's a butter-knife swinging killer rabbit pirate gun. Before we would seam the dress together in real life, we have these ominous shapes. Once everything is connected, ooh, you would look great in that, by the way. So the one key difference here is that in 3D we do it the other way around. We cut the final mesh into flat pieces. Okay, but why do we need to cut up our 3D model anyway? That's because we want to apply texture to it, which elevates the content by 1 trillion in believability and character. It allows us to make a proper dice out of this boring cube, for example. You see, it adds character, it adds details, it adds meaning to your models, which will soon only feel like canvas to you. Oh, and hey, no offense to you, Basecube, you're fine. We will mostly focus on textures here, which we create ourselves by a mix of painting and baking. Painting should be self-explanatory. You just need to imagine the UV as the paper on which you draw onto. Baking is another topic on the other hand. Well, texture baking is easily understood in principle though. Here we have 2 cubes. They are in essence of the same shape. One of them is the dice model which I just showed you. The other one is a very simple base cube. Or we call one of them low poly as it has a low amount of polygons. The other one would be the high poly mesh as it is full of details and has a higher poly count. So far so simple. Complex geometry is an issue in 3D applications though. And the time for our computers to render might stack up. Painting on such complex meshes isn't any fun either, as we would have to deal with input lags and other issues. And that's where we, the 3D artists, turn to our god and savior, texture baking. Now we can bake the information of the complex cube down onto our simple base mesh and establish the illusion. How and to what extent we can use this? Well, that's later in this video. There's so much more that you need to learn before we get to that. As my good old Colombian friend Julito would say, it's all about making baby steps. For now we need to go back to our UVs as it all goes hand in hand. Let me quickly show how UV maps work in principle to the beginners amongst us. Here we have our base cube. We check if its scale is set to 1 over here in object mode. If it isn't, then just hit Ctrl A and apply the scale to set it back to 1. It's really quite important to apply the scale to avoid certain pitfalls like stretching. Okay, now the best way to UV unwrap in my opinion is to open up the actual UV unwrapping layout up here. Okay, then with our cube selected, we go into edit mode by pressing tab and then we press U unwrap. Right now each face is overlapping in the UV space. In text tools we select any of those texture preset resolutions up there. Then we hit the checker map button. This way the checker map texture is applied at the resolution which we set above. Now let's open up the node editor to plug in a texture. Upon hitting the checker map button, a base material was automatically applied and the checker texture is already allocated to that material. Text tools also automatically jumps into texture viewport shading. In this view mode you can see the texture of the image texture node which is selected in the material which is applied to the object. Let's plug in a brick texture to see what's happening here. You can see that this texture is applied over each face consistently. But if you want to paint on this, then our paint strokes will repeat also. You can go into texture paint mode down there. I'm using a full strength paintbrush. And now we can paint on the selected image texture. As you can see, the number which I drew over the single face is repeated over all the others. Therefore, let's go back in and apply seams along the edges. Just follow my selection. Let's go into Edge Select mode with this button here. I added an image on the right side to make this easier for you. The relevant edges are marked yellow there. Once all the seams are selected, you want to hit Ctrl E and mark the seams. When we unwrap now, the UV map looks like a cross. If you have a UV map already, you might need to press the reset button down there first. Okay, just click unwrap again. Blender will then take our marked seams into account and project our mesh flat on the UV space. Now you will notice two things. The texture on our model looks bigger and it is flowing over the edges, which we did mark as UV seams. But the upside here, when we paint in texture mode now, we can paint on each face individually. I'm just gonna look for my inner Picasso and draw some lines on the cube here. Obviously, this is also a great way to identify your faces in the UV window. Now that we have our UV islands in place, we can also bake information from our 3D model onto a underlying texture. The projection will happen based on the UV map. So you're the projection master here, quite a title. Let's go to the default layout and assign some simple red, green and blue diffuse materials to each face. So all we need to do here is to hit the plus button over there 3 times to add 3 different diffuse materials. Then you smack that new button and just choose any color you want. Just make sure that you can distinguish them. Select the faces individually and assign the materials. Of course, it's not a bad idea to go into material mode to actually see what we are doing here. Voila, there we go, what a masterpiece. Alright, let's go back to the UV editing layout. Back in text tools we go down to baking. Let's just also enable material mode again to see our lovely colors, and then we hit this selection menu where we look for diffuse. Zack, there it is, and all that's left is to smack the bake button there. Everything else is done for you. The creation of the underlying texture at the resolution which is set up here, and also the pixel padding to combat pixel bleeding. Those terms will come clear later in this video. You can also just increase the resolution at any time and bake the information again. Now we move on to the essentials. Some things might be quite a bit more complex, others easier to grasp. Basically, it's a movie about UVs and texturing. Sit back, hit the pause button whenever you need to, and hopefully you will understand the stuff I'm telling you. Let's imagine the UV map creation like unfolding a paper model now. Let's flatten out our cube on the UV space. This entire section outlined in green is now our so-called UV island. Let's do the same thing in Blender as a comparison. In Edge Select mode, we select and mark the relevant edges of our cube. Our goal is to create a single UV island for now. On the right side you can see the UV island now in the square UV space. Some of you might have heard the term 0 to 1 space before. Well, the UV space to which we projected the cube is actually a coordinate system ranging from 0 to 1 in float numbers. Therefore, when you unwrap a mesh, you're initially working independently from image size limitations. You're merely indicating the vertex alignment so that the textures can be projected properly. Let me show you how this is represented in Blender. Here's the UV window on the right with the unwrapped cube. In the upper right corner of the properties shelf you can see the vertex coordinates. So when I move the vertex in the UV space, which is scaled to the image resolution of 1024, you can see the XY values adjusting in real time. If you want to get an actual 0 to 1 coordinate, just hit the normalize button here. Now the UV is displayed in a range of 0 to 1 in float numbers. Ooh, what's happening when we move this vertex beyond the UV space of 0 to 1? Well, anything outside is a repetition of the original 0 to 1 space. That means that the UV space actually goes beyond 0 to 1 also, both in the negative and positive range. Here we can see the 0 to 1 space in Blender again. Now let me show you how it repeats itself beyond 0 to 1. Each of these grey tiles is exactly the same as the original 0 to 1 space and merely a repeating pattern. So when we apply a texture on the 0 to 1 space, the texture is repeated over the extended UV space. And at this point we need to talk about textures and square texture presets more thoroughly. The decisions which we need to make when UV unwrapping for texture painting and baking are sometimes tightly interconnected. Here we are in Substance Painter with one of the models which I showed you in the intro. These texture resolutions are quite easy to grasp in principle. Just look at the detail level as I increase the texture resolution. As you can see, the higher we go with this, the better the visual quality. Textures are arrays of pixels which convey information to our 3D program. But let's dive in a little bit deeper here. They essentially breathe life into our 3D models and make modern games look so much more realistic. I assume that you're all familiar with pixels. You know, these tiny dots or squares on your images. We also refer to pixels when talking about our screen devices, of course. In reference to our displays, they are called physical pixels. When we zoom in on our screen, you can make out the RGB LEDs individually. These LEDs then change in value to transcribe the illusion. Let me dim the blue channel. Only green and red are active now. The cone and rod cells in your retina together will interpret these pixels as yellow. With all 3 color channels active, these pixels will appear as white to us. A screen can only ever convey an illusion to you though. And you, my love, are a TRICHROMAT. What sounds like the end post in a Terminator movie actually describes an organism possessing 3 independent channels for perceiving color information. What you see here is potential. The potential to draw close to 16.8 million different colors on your screen by handling only 3 LEDs per pixel. In this image you can see a representation of the receptors contained on our retina. We have 3 types of these color-sensitive cells in our eyes, so-called cone cells. Screen manufacturers then use the way our brain composes colors out of just 3 different types of signals to trick our brain into seeing colors which are not really there. This is based on the principle of additive color or additive mixing, allowing us to predict the appearance of color by adding up the numeric representations of the specific channels. This illusion is perfectly balanced for human eyesight and trichromacy, by the way. Your pet might perceive the colors on your screen differently, while still being able to make out shapes and movement in most cases. You can try it out yourself, by the way. Look at this image, pause the video and move away from your screen. Depending on the distance, you will perceive the image as white, as your brain computes the RGB channels, kind of adding them up by their intensity. Each of these separate RGB channels on a standard screen can display 255 shades of the elementary color, plus white. This is what we call a 24-bit true color screen. A bit is a dimension used in computer mathematics. In relation to pixels, we define the amount of shades of color or its value stored in a pixel by bit. A 1-bit or monochrome pixel can store black and white. Mathematically, we can describe it as 2 by the power of 1. Continuing on a grayscale chart for simplicity reasons, we jump up to 2-bit. Therefore, we have 2 by the power of 2, which is 4. So we have 4 different values of black and white stored in a 2-bit pixel. Then a 4-bit pixel stores 16 or 2 by the power of 4. And finally, an 8-bit pixel stores values of 2 by the power of, you guessed it, 8. To tie back in with the 24-bit color depth, this means that each channel of an RGB pixel can store 8 bits of color variation for each RGB channel. So we can conclude that the bit is defined by this exponent here. This definition of complexity for our pixels also applies to logical pixels. Logical pixels are pixels which are information on your images. So they are the pixels which we work with when handling textures and images in 3D or in image manipulation programs. Laid out on a grid of squares, they specify the color value for each of these squares to draw an image. In a more poetic way of speaking, their alignment on the grid is the language by which image information is transcribed to your eyes. In this tutorial, our focus will be on these logical pixels. So how do these pixels then make up our textures? Logical pixels obviously store color themselves. The additive color mixing principle is the same though, which you can easily verify by checking out the color wheel in Blender. Also, whilst 8-bit color is coded to 255 shades of color per RGB channel, in Blender we choose the color depth of our images upon exporting. Therefore, we describe the levels of color before exporting from 0 to 1. So how do these pixels then make up our textures? A logical pixel on the grid can store a single color. So when we have 16 of those pixels, we could at least call it a line. Adding 16 on Y, we have a resolution of 16 by 16 pixels. So the image is 16 by the power of 2. This amounts to 256 pixels altogether. No, this is not a photo of mine. This is a 16 by 16 pixel self-portrait, currently trading at Sotheby's for 5 mil. I know, right? Appalling likeliness. Modern CGI knows no limits. Right now the information is still crude, but let's split each pixel by 4 to convey more and more precise information. Now we have more pixels and thus more information available. With more information to compute, your PC will also take more time to process said information. Just keep in mind for now that more resolution and color depth takes up more space. Let's jump up to higher fields now, way beyond 32 by 32 pixel textures. As you can see, the difference between a 4K texture and a 32 by 32 pixel texture is huge. A 4K texture image has 4096 times 4096 pixels, which is, let me calculate that in my head real quick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 16,777,216 pixels. Now a 2K texture only amounts to a quarter of those pixels. So we can conclude that the preset textures are apart by a multiplicator of 4. So each texture higher than the previous amounts in 4 times the previous in pixel density. As the amount of pixels increases, so does the memory usage though. That's where the VRAM of your graphics card comes into play. It's the memory to which the textures are loaded into, so really do keep in mind that high resolution results in bigger amounts of data which can exceed your graphics card's VRAM. So next time you see this message in Blender, you might wanna start simplifying your textures first. You'll get this nasty error when your VRAM is insufficient to load the textures and process them. That's also why all the texture sites out there have multiple texture resolutions available. Here you can see my favorite site, cc0textures.com. Leonard aka Struffel is doing an awesome job over there. All textures are free and funded by donors, by the way. Okay, what's next? Texture limitations. Oh, that doesn't sound sexy. So what's this all about? Blender may use an excessive amount of memory to load and process your textures, exceeding the image file size on your hard drive by far. Your images are compressed data in JPEG, PNG or other formats, with varying complexity and color depth. Therefore, a 16-bit 1K texture amounts in uncompressed data of about 4 MB, whilst the compressed image size on your hard drive may only display a few kilobytes. Blender has to be able to read the pixels of your image in a different way than your image display programs or paint tools, as you might want to use the pixel data to control a displacement, a normal or diffuse map, or multiple things at once. Video games, on the other hand, have the huge advantage of being able to load compressed files as everything is happening in an already controlled environment. But I won't leave you hanging there. Here are some solutions to combat the memory issue. For example, look up the unused images in the UV editor and press X whilst holding Shift to clear out the data block. There will be quite a few textures that you don't really need when you are working on extensive scenes. The data which will be cleared out then displays a 0 next to it, as you can see here down there next to the texture names. Those images will then be removed when you open the file again. Blender also handles it automatically though. You can find the GL texture garbage collector in the user prefs under System Texture Timeout. The number here simply defines the time in seconds before unused textures are cleared out. Let's take a look at the Simplify add-on. I can only assume that a lot of you know about it already, but there's something to clarify. Now I will open up a scene with an overabundance of textures from textures.com loaded in the viewport. We can find Simplify here down there in the Scenes tab. Let's first initiate a test render without setting texture limits in the add-on. Okay, that took 17 seconds, with the memory peaking at slightly more than 2300 MB. When we activate the texture limit and go for a really small resolution, we might end up, surprise surprise, with a high render time as the textures need to be downsampled and reprocessed first. But when you take a look at the memory usage, whoa, that's a huge difference. In fact, a 256 x 256 image takes only 1% of the memory that a 2K image does. So now just keep in mind, Simplify does not necessarily reduce your render times, but it makes scenes manageable and renderable. When you don't want to go on yourself and invest hours for reducing your texture sizes, Simplify is the way to go. Or maybe you want to send the file to a render farm, then work on your scene with Simplify enabled and disable it for the actual rendering on the farm. The pro tip here though, if you want to render with Simplify's downsampled textures and you're fine with the quality loss, well, enable the persistent images option. Here's what will happen. Upon rendering for the first time, the low sample versions of your textures will be created, which will take some time. When you hit render again with the persistent images option enabled, the previously computed or downsampled images are still available for quick loading on your GPU. So they don't need to be recomputed. This results in a low memory usage compared to the original textures and a faster render time. I should not think about all the time I stared at a screen waiting for render to finish. No. You can see it up there now. We won 5 seconds and saved a huge amount of VRAM. Ta-da! If you really don't want to use the Simplify add-on, be careful about using the persistent images option. When you allocate large texture files and keep them between frames with the persistent images option, then your VRAM will consistently be filled up, resulting in lags and other issues. Okay, that's dealt with. One more thing regarding the eternal combat against texture limitation, which might be obvious for you pros out there, is scene management. Imagine a heap of coins in your scene. It only serves a background purpose, so let's put a low resolution texture on those. When a character picks one of those up, we'll put a high resolution texture on that specific one. They don't all need to be crispy clear, depending on their distance to the camera. That's all for now regarding textures. Let's go back to our lovely UVs. So let's recap. The UV space represents the projection space of our texture onto our model. Therefore, we could get an optimal pixel density for our beautiful little cube there. In this very specific case, let's unwrap the cube evenly. So each face one by one. The faces overlap in the UV space now. In this case, each face has the same amount of texture pixels assigned to. This is a useful method for 3D models which have repeating details all over, like a sci-fi crate for example. In this case, let me activate the decal machine shader. As you can see, each face displays the same texture now. We may actually use this method for smaller details. Behold this weird model which I just put together. There you can see these similar indents into the geometry, so we could isolate them and apply the same texture on each of those by overlapping the faces in the UV space. Using text tools in the UV editor, I can then select any similar shape with the button down here on the left. Then we can sort them horizontally or vertically to make things a little bit easier. Next up, we enable the snapping tool down on the right with target type to be vertices instead of increments. Grab one of the shapes and move and snap them over each other one by one. This way we can preserve some texture space for the other UV islands. It's a rare use scenario, but I think it's quite useful sometimes. Okay, you learned a lot in regards to textures now. So how does it tie in with the UV space and UV efficiency? Well, let's head back to the paper cut UV here. Currently the UV space is empty and nothing is mapped onto our cube. Here we assign a 1024 by 1024 pixel texture, which amounts to a total of 1,048,576 pixels. Therefore the current UV island would only capture a rather tiny parcel of the available pixels, glowing green now. In fact, we are only using 37.5% of the total amount. A detail loss of 62.5% as you can see. Watch as the area glows in beautiful pink. So yeah, we are losing quite a bit of resolution here. Let's try to unwrap differently now, considering the goal to use the UV space as efficiently as possible. Splitting each face individually, or we could also say splitting each face along its hard edges, we can get up to 60% usage of the UV space. Quick detour here. A hard edge is basically any of these edges on a cube. As you can see, the transition between those faces happens on a steep 90-degree angle. This is what we call a hard edge. Now when I bevel any of those edges, you can see that the transition between the faces on the beveled edges becomes smoother. This will be important later when we bake normal maps for which you want to split the UV islands along their hard edges. Applying this unwrap for our cube, we can achieve a much better texel density. So what's a texel? Okay, so an image is composed of dots arranged on a grid. Each of these dots is called a pixel, which is a term derived from picture element. A texel is simply a pixel within a texture image. In 3D we need to differentiate between screen space and texture space, as a pixel in screen space is a mix of texels making up that pixel on your screen. Later on we will talk about texel density more thoroughly, as it is part of the add-on. Oops, that was my girlfriend down there, say hi to Zoe. Let's go back to our paper cut UVs. As you can see, there is some space between the UV islands. That's the so-called margin, colored in yellow here. Oh, and by the way, the unused space up there is called gutter, just to throw more of that terminology at you. Okay, so the margin of your UVs specifies the safe space of the UV islands in pixels, like an extended border where they won't overlap or come too close to each other. More on that later. Let's check the whole thing in Blender first. Let me mark all seams of the cube and unwrap the bad boy. Right after unwrapping, you can see the specials menu on the lower left side in the tool shelf. You may also hit F6 to bring up the specials menu and adjust the margin value there. You can apply a different margin after packing the islands also. Just hit Ctrl P in the UV window and then F6 in the 3D view. And hey, Ctrl P is a rather essential shortcut. It arranges the UV islands with margins in the UV space. Combine it with an average island scale option to create a consistently sized UV map. So why do we need this margin anyways? Well, you want to avoid so-called pixel bleeding. Pixel bleeding is the overlapping of color onto the wrong UV space. Let's see how this might happen. Here's a cube with blue, green and red applied as diffuse colors onto a UV map without any margins. And now when I bake a low resolution diffuse map, in text tools I just scroll down to baking, apply zero padding and hit the bake button here. And voila, we have a beautiful diffuse map showing up over the UV islands. Now let me apply the texture to the cube on the left, as the right one has the original materials only. I guess you can see the bleeding between the edges. And we can reduce the bleeding effect using high resolution textures. When we apply a 1K, the effect becomes barely noticeable, but would still break up the realism in organic shapes like characters and so forth. Well, that's one reason why we introduce pixel padding over the margins, which is the generated or painted pixels within the gutters around the UV islands, to control the bleed effect between those islands. Excellent tools like Substance Painter fill in the space with consistent color to avoid pixel bleeding and visible UV seams, as you can see in those GIFs from their website. With our margin space established, let's apply this pixel padding to our bake texture. And now I'm repeating myself, but hey, as you can see, the colors are extended beyond the UV islands. We can also fill the margin space with the built-in pixel padding option in text tools. So here we have our cube with zero padding. We are baking down our diffuse color. Now let's bake and we get the UV islands filled with our diffuse material. Let's amp up that value in text tools, hit bake and voila, you can see the extended color values over the margins. In Blender's texture paint mode, we have a handy bleed control, which can be found under options. It's essentially painted pixel padding and only extends outside of your UV islands when drawing along the edges. To showcase this, I'm painting over the seam. You can see once I increase the bleed, it'll paint beyond the UV layout. The bleed is set to 2 pixels now, and here you can see the full opacity paintbrush. Okay, now let me paint over the seam here. I guess you can't really see it with 2 pixels only. Okay, let's amp up that bleed value and we are painting even further beyond the UV seam now. Quite a great feature to have in Blender. Okay, I was wrestling with this quite hard to be honest. Let's assume we want to get a precise pixel margin between UV islands which come close to each other. Text Tools already displays the perfect pixel padding values as you can see here. Just remember, that's 8 pixels outwards of each UV island, therefore 16 pixels for the margin space. So I first thought the easiest way to check how it works would be to unwrap a cube and apply a 64 by 64 texture, or any other low pixel count texture. After unwrapping, we hit Ctrl P and we get a value input from 0 to 1. Then I figured, hey, this must be a percentage number, right? So 1 would be equal to 64 pixels in this scenario. But when you increase the value to 1, that's obviously not the case. So here's what I did to get to the bottom of this. I went into GIMP, created a 100 pixel texture, applied filter, artistic, cubism, and set the child size of 1 to visualize each pixel individually. Then I plugged it into the UV/image editor and set the UV space to 100 pixels in text tools. Next up, I increased the margin space to be 1. Then I lined up the UV islands over the respective pixels and counted them, and I was close to 18 pixels. So if the margin number of 1 equals roughly 18.5 pixels, then we can use 0.18 as our base factor for other texture presets. So I went up to 4096 to get a more precise number, and finally decided to go with 0.19, which seems to work almost perfectly for the square texture presets beyond 1024. So let's go up to 4096 by 4096, for example. We can then just multiply 4096 by 0.19, which results in 778.24. Then 16 divided by 778.24 displays the margin input needed to get roughly 16 pixels from each island. This number of 0.19 is really just an approximation, a baseline for you to get a good margin space, which is neither too small nor too large. If you wanted to apply a 16 pixel padding for any reason on a 512 pixel texture, you might want to go with 0.18 according to my tests. But honestly, the 0.19 value is pretty solid, as we won't need more than 8 pixel padding for a 4096 texture anyway. You can also just plug in a pixel texture like the one I made in GIMP and count the pixels between the UV islands. Okay, let's do it together real quick. Let's simply put the texture resolution in our calculator, and then we multiply by the magic number. The resulting number is 389.12. Therefore, we divide our desired pixel padding by this number to get the margin value input. Yeah, not even a madman would type that all in, so just round it off. Next we perform the good old Ctrl+P and type in the resulting value. Obviously, you should only count between UV islands which are packed close to each other. That's simply because the margin space cannot be consistent on a complex UV map with differently sized UV islands. Now let me stress why this margin space is so important, like say for exporting to a game engine. Here you can see the cube without the established margin space. As we lower the resolution of the diffuse texture, the bleeding effect increases. This is an aspect of LOD, short for level of detail, which refers to lower sample versions of a mesh and its textures. Those are loaded into memory depending on the distance to the camera, as we wouldn't be able to make out specific details anyway. This is not only specific to game engines, it's also present in Blender's viewport, including Eevee. Check this out. When I disable the mipmapping in the user preferences, the original texture is maintained, and no smaller resolution versions are created. Also takes less memory when it's disabled, but can look pretty bad sometimes. Let's head back to our UV maps. I can see it in your eyes, you know? You're thinking it. I can tell. You want to scale the UV map to the y-axis in order to achieve a higher pixel density. You are a smart one, but there's a big but. Here's why we don't want to stretch our UV maps, in most cases at least. Let me jump straight to the conclusion. When you stretch the UV map, you introduce non-uniform texel density. And you also apply a different mapping aspect ratio. Just think about it this way. We usually have multiple objects in a scene using different textures and UV maps. You can see an example here where one model has these stretched rectangles and the other one displays proper sexy squares. Keep in mind that when you scale the UV map on one single object, then you're doing so specifically for that one model. But your transforms would be different for all the others. This is certainly bad in game art, where you need to take texel density and consistent UV maps into account. Everything on your model will be stretched to the axis to which you scaled the UV island to. So if you want to apply any kind of texture later on, then you will see this texture will be stretching and possibly looking quite awkward. Let me show you what I'm on about. Here's playing with uniform scale, as you can see. Now let me unwrap that. The initial unwrap should retain the aspect ratio of the original mesh, as long as its scale is consistent. Okay, we select the lower left vertex and place the cursor there. Then make sure to select the Constrain to Image Bounds option. Then after selecting all the vertices, we can comfortably scale the UV map. Now let me quickly add a diffuse material and back to the UV layout. I select the diffuse shader and press Ctrl+T to plug in an image with the node wrangler. And the image I'm using is this one from Pixabay. This gracious guy. Okay, save image as. Oh, hey, He's already on my desktop. But why shouldn't the image be there already? That's quite the desktop background candidate. Really, anyone should have this on their desktop. Alright, the image is applied and it's stretching. So the contextuality, my favorite word in this tutorial, is kinda broken. Here are both images now, the one with the proper aspect ratio and the stretched image. Both contain the same amount of pixels, but the stretched one is non-uniform, as accentuated here again. We could do all kinds of shenanigans with this now. I personally got inspired by the sulky face, so as an artist I had to obviously develop and expand that idea. Okay, so this was more about stretching connected to aspect ratio. But what if we have a complex model which has only some parts stretching, and among those only in certain areas? Let's take Suzanne as an example here. So after adding Suzanne, we hit this Generate UVs button. And in the UV editor now, let's enable the stretching display. As you can see, even the prepared UV of our Suzanne is stretching in some parts. And that's okay. UVs should be done with certain rules in mind for optimal results. They will never be perfect. When the stretching is too much to bear though, you need to go in and fix your UV maps, which in most cases means that we add more seams and split the areas where stretching is apparent. Let's take this cylinder as a simple example. I'm adding seams top and bottom along the circle edges. Let's unwrap and oof, see that nasty yellow there? So this stretch display here tells us that the square pixels of our textures won't be square on the object in this area. In this case, it's super duper easy to fix it with just one seam to properly flatten out the curving cylinder. Here's another cool way to visualize stretching or to identify the sections on your 3D model where it is extreme. Let's use text tools and apply the checkerboard texture by simply hitting this button here. Oh, smooth as hell. As you can see, the checker map isn't consistently square, so let's hit the Select Sync option to sync the selection between the UV editor and the 3D space. In this case it might be a bit arbitrary, but you get the idea. It helps a great deal to pre-visualize and identify stretching areas before we paint our complex textures. Yeah, stretching is a tough topic, and it's hard to put a finger on the absolute best solution. Even harder when you take the following into account. Sometimes you will be the perpetrator of stretching UVs. Here we have this curving shape collapsing slightly on one side. Now when I unwrap this, we get curved UV islands also. As we want to unwrap in order to bake textures down also, we want to avoid these curving shapes, which is connected to the aliasing effect. So we want to rectify the shape, which you can find in text tools. Shwoop, and the shape is straightened out now. We did introduce some slight stretching though, as you can see by the marginally lighter blue tone. I guess there are shapes which would stretch way too much to actually justify this method, but it is largely up to your judgment. Just use the color space of the stretch display to make up your mind. One more reason which justifies this method greatly is the fact that it is so much more convenient to paint on straight UV maps. Another plus point is that they are so much more space efficient, making it easier for you to arrange UV islands in the UV space. Here I baked a normal map to get the beveled edges over the base low poly mesh. Everything works quite well without any apparent stretching or aliasing issues. To explain my point here, let me show you the difference in the baked normal textures between the straight UV map and the curved ones. If you imagine the texels of the underlying texture over a curved shape, then these steps here might look bad in a game engine due to specific texture filtering processes. In reference to that, we should clear up some points in regards to texture filtering. As we established earlier, the scenes which we make in 3D are drawn to our screen in pixels. The amount of pixels is obviously limited by our output devices. Your screen can draw only so many pixels. In this setup, let me exaggerate and scale up a screen pixel. Okay, here's our pixel on the raster graphic, which is yet to be rendered. This is obviously zoomed in quite a bit down to the square pixel visualization. Okay, I'm not sure if it helps here, but here we go. When you zoom in with the camera now, you can clearly make out that there are super duper many TEXELs all over the place. But we want Blender to project those onto the screen as an image. So these pixels will be computed by a multitude of TEXELs. This is what we call MINIFICATION, the filtering of multiple TEXELs to make up a single pixel. What we see here is a simplified mismatch in position between the pixel to be rendered on its pixel array and the TEXELs in their 3D positions. So what happens in the back is the weighted average interpolation of pixel color to be determined by its surrounding TEXELs. When the 4 nearest TEXELs are to determine the pixel color, we talk about BILINEAR interpolation. Beside minification, there is magnification. In this context, we have less TEXELs covering more pixels. So a small amount of TEXELs is interpolated to define a pixel's color. These two concepts fall under the term texture filtering. So texture filtering is either happening to reconstruct sparse data to fill in the information, which is magnification, or the reverse, where texture samples exist at a higher frequency, meaning more TEXELs for less pixels, which is minification. We animate our objects to be rotated, scaled and moving during frames. One pixel on the rendered raster graphic therefore almost never corresponds to one TEXEL. The missing data needs to be computed to a pixel though, and that's where the filtering kicks in, mostly resulting in blurriness after filling in the sparse data. We established a while ago that Mipmapping renders smaller versions of a texture into the memory in levels. It's essentially a pre-filter based on the distance of the viewer or camera to the textured object in question. Texture filtering would be too resource heavy to determine a pixel color on the entirety of available TEXELs of an object which is far in the distance. I guess you can imagine that to be a resource heavy procedure, and that's why Mipmapping is such a common and simple but great solution to this issue. There are quite a few filtering interpolations available, using different amounts of hardware resources, which I won't go into detail further. You got the gist. Okay, let's at least talk about anisotropic filtering. You can find it in the user preferences. Enabling it can help to get much better filtering for mipmaps amongst other things. The performance is only marginally impacted. You're probably sitting here asking yourself, okay Jojo, but what's the point of telling me about texture filtering? Well, first of all, I think it helps to have an idea about what's happening under the hood, to understand the relation of your texture sizes to the quality of your final output image, for example. Then there is the fact that Blender's image texture node has these interpolation modes here, which people barely ever change. Blender's image texture node is set to linear by default. Linear interpolation surveys the 2 closest TEXELs to draw a pixel. A straight line between 2 points on the TEXEL centers is computed to the output pixel data, and the resulting image is drawn over the 3D model. As you're smarty pants, you made the deduction yourself. Linear is the antecedent to bilinear interpolation. Before you jump to conclusions though, it's not worth to using bilinear or higher in our case. We want sharp textures with proper details at a quick turnaround. So linear filtering should be enough to achieve the best representation of our defined image input. Cubic, on the other hand, is more resource heavy than bilinear. It achieves a higher accuracy at the cost of processing time though. If you want to get better results for bump maps, for example, you might want to enable it specifically for those as suggested in the Blender manual. Next up we have closest, which defines the absence of interpolation. This is what you want to use when you are working on 8-bit or Minecraft animations and the like, as you don't want your pixels to be interpolated and upsampled. As we are talking about texturing, let me throw the term anti-aliasing at you. The aliasing effect is in essence all about the jaggedness of slanted edges in computer graphics. Here we can see the grid, which represents the array of pixels in a raster image texture. On the right side you can see a red colored plane mesh right now. Let's bake the diffuse color down on our 10x10 grid. In this extreme close-up, we can clearly make out the resulting jaggedness or stepping between the pixels. Well, obviously we don't have enough pixels to represent the original shape. Therefore, the aliasing is apparent here. We could now filter the pixels, resulting in blurriness, and hope that it looks okay at a distance. Or we fix the issue by using a high resolution texture. Looks fine at a distance. And now with a mix of both, and zooming back in, you can see the effects of filtering pixels. Obviously, aliasing is a much bigger topic in video games, but hey, this is essentially what's happening. In text tools, you can find an anti-aliasing option. There are 3 basic presets. Either we go without it and accept the hard pixel edges, but baking's a lot faster, or we apply 2 steps or 4 steps of AA. Text tools and downsamples the final bake internally and mixes it with the original bake to achieve a smoother outline and transition. You can use it with all existing bake options, and it's fairly essential to use it for normal bakes, where jagged details may become an obvious issue. Here we have a simple plane mesh and a plane with an outpushing line shape. As you can see, when I baked a normal map, we get this step diagonal pixel line drawn here. Now let me bake again with anti-aliasing at 2, and we get a slightly smoother transition between the pixels here, which will be a bit harder to make out visually. The following passage is about texel density, a topic which is essential to game art. If you want to skip it as an animator, hey, that's fine. On the other hand, I personally think it's a simple enough concept which can help you to build more complex scenes. Especially with Eevee around the corner and one day an interactive mode. Usually when we are creating scenes, we need to adhere to certain guidelines. We want our scenes to be believable. Therefore, objects should be scaled in relation to each other. Texel density is the term to hold this in check in regards to texture size to UV relations. In this image, the texel density is consistent, meaning each object in the scene has approximately the same texel size associated. Texel density is important for environments. Characters would usually get a higher texel density. The same applies for weapons, which are constantly close to the camera, of course. Now let's look at bad texel density as a comparison. I think it's obvious that this scene would look a lot worse to viewers. The inconsistent texture sizes would cause blurry pixel filtering and simply demotes the feeling of realism. Let's quickly build a scene ourselves to explain some aspects of texel density. Therefore, we need to first change the dimensions in Blender. We can enable metric scaling for referencing over here in the Scenes tab. Simply switch from Blender units to meters. Now the edge length is defined in meters. So when I add a plane now, this plane will inherit a scale of 2 square meters by default. You can hit N in edit mode to display the edge length down here, by the way. Let me scale it to be 1 meter by 1 meter. So basically just select the plane, hit S and then type in 0.5. Super, let's do the classic move here and switch to UV editing. Let's now unwrap the plane and apply a 2K texture. By the way, you can hover your mouse over the preset numbers, and whilst holding Ctrl, just scroll the mouse wheel to change the input. So this 1 meter plane in our scene now covers 2048 times 2048 pixels. The resulting texel density is commonly unitized by dividing the pixel preset number or the pixel density of your reference plane, in this case 2048, by 100, which corresponds to 100 centimeters, therefore to 1 meter. So the texel density in our scene is 20.48. Maybe this helps to understand it also. We are effectively giving a texel a physical dimension. So our 1 meter plane is 1 meter or 2048 texels long. It's important to note here that texel density is a visual consistency guideline. We still have to apply padding and therefore a margin space, which will undoubtedly create inconsistencies. These small inconsistencies should be pretty insignificant for the viewer though. Let me add a cube to our little scene here. In the end, it should have the same texel density as the plane. Let's move it up 1 unit so its origin is on the same coordinate in space as the plane, and scale it down to sit on the plane at about half the size. Immediately applied scale, quite important if you remember. So Ctrl A, select scale. When I mark all sharp edges as seams, hit A, select all, Ctrl E, mark seam, we can unwrap the cube, hit U. Let's go back to our plane and hit this dropper button here, in order to obtain its texel density. If you unwrapped it without any margins, then it should display 2048. If you did indeed apply a margin, then it should be slightly less. Okay, let me quickly reset the base plane to a 0 margin. Okay, there we go. Now hit the drop icon and obtain the value. Excellent. Let me select a cube, which I already unwrapped here, with all edges as seams. And we hit the apply button. Okay, we need the texture first, so simply give it the base checker map. And now when you hit apply, your UV islands might overlap. If it's only an itsy bitsy, then you can fix it with a higher margin space. But of course, you're changing the texture density then, so don't overdo it. So it's a huge helper to quickly make the UV maps of multiple objects consistent to a specific texel density. Voila, and that's texel density for you. Not really that hard, is it? As always, there are a few more things to consider. Let's create another cube and make it a fair bit larger, and apply scale, of course. When you apply the texel density to your cube now, its faces overlap in the UV space. Obviously, we can't cover the physical space of the cube with the 1 meter to 2048 square pixels ratio. Simply put, the surface area of the cube is much bigger than the surface of the plane, which is the original guideline for our set texel density. Basically, we want to wrap the guideline surface area around the cube, which is impossible due to the size discrepancies. Therefore, let's plug in a higher resolution texture. Just go with 4096 and hit the checker map button. Hit apply, and voila, things are back in place properly. A quick little tip which I learned from Wes McDermott from the Substance team. If you want to use a low resolution texture in a predefined texel density environment, well, just tile it appropriately. Meaning a 512 texture on 1 meter would need to tile 4 times to stay adequate to our specific texel density of 20.48. Therefore, all we need to do is to tile the texture 4 times with the mapping node on the unwrapped plane. This can be quite effective for your ground planes as a baseline to add grass and other environmental elements on top later. In animation, we don't care about this the same way game artists do, as you just get away so much easier. But I think it can help to keep it in mind. These damn players can sneakily run around in your scene though, and make out all the inconsistencies it may offer. There are certainly quite a few more things to consider, and we just scratched the surface of the topic, but next time you hear it, you know what's up. Okay then Jojo, you might say, what image format should I use upon exporting? So as an expert in saving images, guys, I have saved so many images in my career. I would say, cause it's tricky. So let's first reiterate about 2 essential topics regarding images. When we export images, we usually compress them. We then choose a lossless or a lossy file format. Lossy algorithms look super sexy on first sight, as they are small on your hard drive, and we are all familiar with JPEG. Here's the problem though, lossy formats introduce some heavy degradation in the image to achieve the smaller file size. These artifacts may present themselves as banding and pixelation issues, which are especially visible on normal maps. A lossless compression algorithm, on the other hand, discards no information. It represents the image simply more efficiently, without a loss in accuracy. Let's recall the difference between hard drive space and memory usage of images. So here's why textures are actually so big in your VRAM. Images consume VRAM depending on their width and height and bit depth, meaning a PNG and a JPEG both might take up a lot of VRAM depending on the quality settings for either format. The compression level has no impact. To cut to the chase here, at least don't use JPEG as your final and only output. JPEG is a lossy file format based on conceptual coding. It samples your colors down, causing artifacts in almost all types of texture bakes. And then there is PNG. PNG is a lossless file format, and therefore it doesn't take up all that much space on your hard drive after compression. PNGs also store up to 16 bits per each RGB channel. If you remember the pixel topic from earlier in this video, then you should know that the increase in bits per channel can make a difference in quality. I'm saying this a lot, but this is important in regards to normal maps. TIFF is the in-betweener here. Again, we have 16-bit per channel, but 3 different compression types in Blender. LCW is a once patented compression algorithm by Lempel, Sif and Welk. It is apparently, judging by the information which I could gather, less effective than the Deflate algorithm, which creates lossless, small files. Deflate is also known as zip compression. PackBits is a fast and apparently obsolete compression method. Anyways, there's nothing against this format. Indeed, it is preferred to PNG by certain render engines. It's a flexible format in many ways. So for normal maps and animations with complex scenes, I would suggest a 16-bit per channel TIFF should be enough. TGA or Targa in Blender is 24 bits, therefore 8 bits per channel and 32 bits if you select the RGBA option, effectively adding 8 bits for the alpha channel. I'm simply mentioning it, maybe someone can vouch for it in the comments, but I don't see the added value here. Also lossless compression, I assume they are more or less replaced by PNG. And then there's OpenEXR. Simply put, it allows for amazing results in normal maps, but the space requirements are in my honest opinion too extreme. But if you work on crispy animations with not too many different objects in the scene, hey, why not? They are only ever really useful in conjunction with normal maps though. Maybe also for displacement and bump maps if you really need to be utter precise there. I also dropped a link in the description which will lead you to CG Cookie, where they show a great way to make use of the 32-bit float OpenEXR normal map after dithering and converting the file. But of course, we'll also talk about normal maps in the next part of the series. This should clear up some confusions then. Finally, let me tell you why these images are best saved in powers of 2. So like 512 times 512. Simply put, this is how your graphics card works. Some GPUs can only handle textures with sizes in powers of 2. So an image of 450 times 450 might actually be stored in a 512 times 512 space in VRAM. So obviously that's a 1-to-1 ratio, but what happens to other textures? Well, 1-to-2 is also fine for modern graphics cards. So a 510 to 249 would be stored as a 512 times 256 image. So the added memory space is essentially lost, but it's just the way it is, my friends. And you can look up the story behind it if you will. Na na na. Okay, moving on. Holla die Waldfee. That was a lot of stuff. How about a dense recap then? Well, hit it lads. First of all, we need to unwrap our model. UV seams should definitely fall on hard edges, but the reverse is not true. Meaning not only hard edges can and must be UV seams, and UV seams don't have to be sharpened in any way. Generally speaking, we want as little UV islands as possible, which means less seams. But at the same time, we want to use the UV space as efficiently as possible to attain an equally efficient texel density. It is vital to establish a margin to avoid pixel bleeding. We then fill the margin space with pixel padding during texture baking. Simple but effective color extensions which help to avoid visible UV seams before and after texture filtering processes kick in. We should avoid curving UV shapes if possible, especially for game art and other real-time or viewport renders, with mipmapping and other texture filtering processes in mind. This way we'll get much better normal bake results. And hot damn, they are so much easier to paint on. We can mirror objects which have repeating details to save texture space. And all these repeating details could merit from overlaying UV islands. Ah, so much space saved. Finally, we need to decide for a texture resolution. Higher resolution textures take up more memory and hard drive space. The amount of output data correlates to the pixel amount, its color variety and its color depth. These color parameters are collapsed to a specific amount of bits depending on the export format. The export format may be compressed, lossy or lossless, depending on your needs and hardware capabilities. And then we can bake details down, color, ambient occlusion, normal maps and much more. But I'm freaking tired now and I feel like a sponge left in the goddamn desert, so that stuff is for part 2 in the series. Until then, gorditas and gorditos, have a monacious day and remember to bake me some cake. I'm Jojo from Moonman Pictures, ready for takeoff. Shit, I forgot to tell you about my Patreon. Okay, bye.